The shovel struck a stone with a percussive clang that vibrated up the hickory handle and into the bones of Ilara's arms. She paused, leaning on the tool, her breath a white plume in the sharp November air. The hole was already 9 feet deep, a precise rectangle carved from the unyielding northern soil. It was slow work. Each shovelful felt heavier than the last, a mixture of dark earth, clay, and the occasional stubborn rock that had to be worried free with a pickaxe. Beside the growing mound of displaced dirt, her dog Boro lay with his great black head on his paws, his intelligent eyes following her every move. He did not whine or fidget. He simply watched, a silent, patient witness to her strange and solitary labor. The land was hers now. The small cabin, the 30 acres of birch and pine, the relentless sky, all of it had passed to her when her parents were taken by the fever 2 years prior. She was 19, and the solitude was a garment she had learned to wear, but it was the inheritance from her grandfather, gone a decade, that occupied her now. It wasn't land or money, but a collection of leather-bound journals stored in a dusty trunk in the loft. His handwriting was a dense, forward-leaning script filled with diagrams, calculations, and observations about the natural world. He had been an engineer, a man the locals considered eccentric, who saw the world not as a thing to be conquered, but as a series of elegant systems to be understood. Last night, huddled by the dwindling fire in the wood stove, she had read the chapter titled The Winter Sun. It was not about astronomy. It was a plan, audacious and seemingly impossible, a method for capturing the cold itself and turning it into warmth. The earth beneath the frost line holds a constant, gentle heat, he wrote, and water, in its passage to ice, gives up a tremendous energy. The trick is not to fight the winter, but to harness its primary transaction. The journal detailed the construction of what he called a geothermal heat battery, a massive, insulated underground reservoir designed to freeze solid, and in that process of freezing, release enough latent heat to warm a small home through a closed-loop system of pipes. "He's mad," she had whispered to Boro, but the calculations were precise, the physics sound. It was the kind of elegant, counterintuitive idea that felt like truth. A voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You aimin' to dig clear through to China, Ilara?" Silas Croft stood at the edge of the woods, a heavy axe resting on his shoulder. He was a man made of cordwood and convention, his face a road map of hard winters. His woodpile, already stacked high as his roofline, was a monument to his belief in the simple, brutal arithmetic of survival. Cold demanded fire, fire demanded wood. "Just making a root cellar, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice quiet. It was easier than explaining. He grunted, his gaze falling on her own meager woodpile. It was barely a quarter of what he considered adequate. "That won't see you through January. A girl alone can't be playing games with winter. It's a hungry wolf, and that little stack of kindling is a rabbit. You need a man to swing an axe for you." "I have a plan," she said. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "A plan? Everyone's got a plan until the first real blizzard hits, till the temperature drops to 30 below and the wind is trying to peel the shingles off your roof. Then there's only one plan that works." He patted his axe. "This one." He shook his head, a look of pity in his eyes, and continued on his way. The sound of his boots crunching on the frosted leaves faded, leaving Ilara alone with the hole in the ground and the weight of his doubt. She picked up her shovel. The hole needed to be 12 feet deep. The work consumed her days. The sun rose later and set earlier, squeezing the light from the sky. Her hands, already calloused from farm work, grew thick and hard. Blisters formed, broke, and healed into new layers of protective skin. Her back ached with a deep, permanent fire. Each night, she would collapse onto her cot, too tired to eat much, and Boro would lick her raw hands before settling on the floor beside her. She didn't dream. She simply fell into a black, dreamless pit of exhaustion and rose before dawn to enter the earthen one she was digging herself. Liam, the boy who drove the supply truck from the town 20 miles south, was the only other person who spoke to her that week. He was quiet like she was, with kind eyes that didn't judge. He set down her sacks of flour and salt, his gaze drifting to the enormous pit. He didn't mock or warn. He just asked, his curiosity genuine. "What's it for?" Elara wiped a smear of dirt from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Heat," she said. He nodded slowly as if that made perfect sense. "Looks like a lot of work." "It is." "Need any help?" She looked at him, surprised. No one had offered to help. They only offered warnings. "I can manage." He lingered for a moment, then tipped his cap. "All right then. See you next week." He left, and she felt a small, unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with her project. It was the simple kindness of his question. By the end of the second week, the pit was finished. 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, 12 feet deep. It was a wound in the earth, a shadow that deepened as the sun arced low across the sky. Now came the harder part. According to her grandfather's journal, the reservoir had to be waterproof. She needed clay. The creek bed, a half-mile walk through the woods, was rich with it. For 4 days she hauled it back bucket by heavy bucket, her boots sinking into the cold mud. She mixed it with straw, her bare hands plunging into the icy slurry, and began to line the pit. It was painstaking work, plastering the thick gray paste onto the walls and floor, smoothing it until it was a seamless, impermeable shell. Boro would occasionally nose at the buckets, sniffing the wet, earthy smell before retreating to his post. Next were the pipes. Her grandfather had purchased them years ago, 176 feet of gleaming copper tubing, stored in crates in the barn. They were her only real expense besides the small, hand-cranked circulation pump she'd ordered with Liam. Following the diagrams in the journal, she laid the copper tubing in a complex, looping grid across the floor of the pit. Another set of pipes ran up to the surface, ready to be connected. The final piece of the excavation was the most dangerous. A narrow tunnel, just wide enough for her to crawl through, connecting the pit to the crawl space beneath her cabin. She shored it up with thick timbers from the barn, her heart pounding in the close, dark space. The smell of damp earth was overpowering. The thought of it collapsing was a constant, cold presence at the back of her mind. When she finally broke through the stone foundation of the cabin, she lay in the darkness for a long time, covered in dirt, listening to the sound of her own breathing. The first snowflakes began to fall the day she finished the tunnel. They were fat, wet flakes that melted on her cheeks, a gentle harbinger of the fury to come. A sense of urgency propelled her. She worked by lantern light, digging a shallow trench to divert a small nearby stream. Cold, clear water began to trickle into the clay-lined pit. It took 2 full days to fill. When it was done, she stood at the edge of a still black pool that perfectly reflected the bruised twilight sky. Mrs. Gable came by that evening, a steaming pot of stew in her hands. She was a kind woman, whose concern was as heavy and smothering as a winter quilt.
"Elara, child," she
said, her eyes wide as she stared at the massive pool of water next to the cabin.
"Silas Croft says you've lost your senses. What is all this? The ground will freeze and crack that lining, and in the spring you'll have a mud pit that'll swallow your whole cabin." "It's supposed to freeze," Elara said, taking the stew. The warmth of the pot felt good in her cold hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable." You can't live on stubbornness alone, the older woman pleaded. The mayor was talking about it in the store. He thinks you're a danger to yourself. He's talking about sending someone out here to check on you once the snows really set in.
I'll be fine, Ilara said. It was her only defense. A simple, quiet statement that no one ever believed. The temperature dropped that night, and the next. A hard frost silvered the ground, and a thin sheet of ice formed on the surface of the water. Ilara watched it from her window, a strange sense of anticipation building in her chest. For the next week, as the cold deepened, the ice thickened. It grew downward, an inch, then 6 inches, then a foot. She sealed the connecting tunnel, insulated the pipes leading to her cabin with thick wraps of wool and canvas, and connected them to the hand-cranked pump and the 3 small cast-iron radiators she had installed inside. The townspeople saw the massive block of ice forming beside her home, and the talk grew. She had built an icebox, they said. She was courting death. Croft's words became the town's verdict. She'll be a popsicle by Christmas. They saw a monument to foolishness. She saw the heart of her winter son slowly coming to life. By mid-December, the pit was frozen solid. A 10-foot thick block of solid ice was now fused with the earth beside her home. The surface was a milky, opaque landscape of trapped air bubbles and fracture lines. Winter had arrived in earnest, burying the world in a deep, silent blanket of white. The temperature hovered near 0. Inside her cabin, the wood stove was cold. Her small woodpile remained untouched. She took a deep breath and primed the small pump. With a creak of the handle, she began to circulate the mixture of water and glycol through the system. Down into the copper pipes at the bottom of the frozen reservoir, where the Earth's own temperature, a constant 45 degrees, was working against the ice. And back up into her cabin. It was a slow process. For the first hour, nothing happened. The radiators remained cold to the touch. Doubt, cold and sharp as an icicle, began to prick at the edges of her certainty. Boro whined softly, sensing her anxiety, and rested his head on her knee. She kept pumping, the rhythmic squeak of the handle the only sound in the quiet cabin. Then she felt it. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift. She placed her hand on the radiator closest to the pump. It was no longer ice cold. A faint, gentle warmth was bleeding into the iron. It wasn't the roaring, aggressive heat of a wood fire, but a steady, persistent warmth. It was the temperature of a living thing. She moved her hand from the radiator to Boro's flank, and the heat felt the same. She laughed, a short, surprised bark of a sound. Boro's tail thumped once against the floorboards. Outside, the snow fell thicker. The wind began to howl, a low moan that built into a piercing shriek. The world disappeared into a swirling vortex of white. But inside Ilara's cabin, a quiet, impossible warmth bloomed in the heart of the cold. The blizzard began as a whisper and grew into a roar that lasted for 4 days. It was a storm that would be spoken of for generations, the kind that scoured the landscape and remade it in its own stark image. Snow piled in drifts that buried fences and swallowed sheds. The temperature plummeted to -42 degrees, a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight, a presence that cracked trees and froze the air in one's lungs. The power lines, heavy with ice, snapped with reports like rifle shots, plunging the entire region into a deep, primal darkness. In town, and in the scattered homesteads around it, people huddled by their fires, feeding them constantly. The wind found every crack and crevice, its icy fingers stealing the heat almost as fast as it could be generated. They burned through their woodpiles at an alarming rate. Ilara's cabin was an island of calm in the maelstrom. The wind battered the walls and screamed at the windows, but inside, a steady, silent warmth radiated from the 3 small radiators. The temperature held at a comfortable 65 degrees. There was no smoke, no fire to tend, no fear of running out of fuel. Every few hours, she would simply crank the pump handle for 10 minutes, circulating the fluid. Boro slept soundly, his body relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in winter before. The project had worked. Her grandfather's theory, born from ink and paper, was now a living, breathing reality. The winter sun was real. On the 3rd day of the storm, a frantic pounding at her door startled her. She opened it to a figure caked in snow, his face rimmed with ice. It was Silas Croft's son, Thomas, a boy of 16. "Our fire's almost out," he shouted over the wind. "The chimney's iced over and the house is filling with smoke. He's so cold. We've burned through nearly everything." "Bring him here," Ilara said without hesitation. An hour later, Thomas returned, half carrying his father. Silas Croft, the man of cordwood and certainty, was shivering violently, his skin a pale, waxy blue. He stumbled into the cabin and stopped, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from the warm, glowing lantern to the frost-free windows. He looked at the empty, cold wood stove. And then he felt it, the gentle, pervasive warmth. "How?" he whispered, his teeth chattering. "There's no fire." "The ice," Ilara said simply, gesturing with her head toward the wall that bordered the pit. He stared at her, his life's worth of conventional wisdom shattering in the face of this impossible reality. He was standing in a warm room in the middle of the worst blizzard of his life, and the source of the heat was a giant block of ice. He sank into a chair, the fight gone out of him, and simply absorbed the warmth. They were not the last to arrive. Liam, who had been caught on the road when the storm hit, fought his way to her door that evening, his supply truck abandoned in a massive drift a mile away. He brought with him Mrs. Gable and her husband, whose roof had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow. They arrived bundled and fearful, their faces etched with cold and desperation. They stepped inside and fell silent, their expressions mirroring Croft's own shock. The next morning, Mayor Thompson and his family arrived on a snowmobile, the machine's engines sputtering in the extreme cold. He, a man of wealth and influence, who had openly mocked her project as the folly of a grief-stricken girl, now stood in her small, crowded cabin, his pride stripped away by the brutal, democratic cold. He did not speak. He simply removed his icy gloves and held his hands out toward the nearest radiator, a silent admission of his error. For 2 more days, Ilara's small cabin became a sanctuary. 12 people and 1 large dog shared the small space. They slept on the floor, in chairs, leaning against each other. They shared Ilara's food and drank melted snow, and they all marveled at the quiet, constant miracle of the warmth. They would watch as Ilara, every few hours, calmly cranked the pump handle, the simple mechanical action that kept them all from freezing. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the very element that sought to destroy them, they were kept alive by a block of ice and the quiet stubbornness of a girl they had all dismissed. The skeptics had become refugees, and her folly had become their salvation. When the storm finally broke, the world was silent and transformed. A brilliant, blinding sun shone on a landscape of impossible white. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of melting icicles. The roads were gone, the power was out, and the town was completely isolated. But they were alive. One by one, as the paths were slowly cleared, the temporary residents of Ilara's cabin departed. They left with few words, but their faces held a new expression when they looked at her, a mixture of awe, gratitude, and profound respect. Mayor Thompson was the last to leave. He stood at the door, a man humbled.
"Thank you, Elara," he said, his voice thick. "We owe you our lives." He didn't say more, but she knew something fundamental had shifted. A few days later, once he had repaired his chimney and assessed his own dwindling wood supply, Silas Croft returned. He did not bring his son. He came alone, holding his worn cap in his hands. He stood before her on the packed snow, not as a man offering pity, but as a student before a master. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out quiet and heavy, each one costing him a piece of his long-held pride. 50 winters I've seen in this valley. 50 winters of splitting wood, stacking it, burning it. I thought I knew everything there was to know about staying warm, about survival. He looked past her, at the great frozen mound, its surface now glittering in the sun. "I never saw this. I looked at what you were doing, and all I saw was a fool's errand."
I didn't see the sense in it. He met her eyes. "Can you teach me?" Elara nodded. She went inside and returned with her grandfather's journal, its leather cover worn smooth. She opened it to the chapter on the winter sun and handed it to him. He took it with a reverence usually reserved for a holy book. That spring, and into the summer, a new sound echoed through the valley. It was the sound of shovels striking earth. Led by Silas Croft, who had become Elara's most fervent disciple, the townspeople began to dig. They worked together, moving from one homestead to the next. Elara, with her quiet confidence and her grandfather's journals, directed them. She explained the principles of latent heat, of geothermal exchange, of insulation and fluid dynamics. They listened, their skepticism replaced by a desperate, hopeful curiosity. Liam became her constant companion in the work. He was practical and quick to learn, and he had a way of organizing the crews that Elara, in her solitary nature, lacked. He became the bridge between her quiet knowledge and the community's eager hands. They worked side by side through the long summer days, their shared purpose forging a bond deeper than words. He didn't just respect her knowledge, he respected her. He saw the strength in her stillness, the wisdom in her silence. Their conversations were brief, but their understanding was complete. Mayor Thompson, true to his word, funded the materials. Crates of copper tubing and circulation pumps arrived on Liam's truck. The town's resources were mobilized not for recovery, but for revolution. They were rebuilding their community, not as it was, but as it could be, resilient, self-sufficient, and free from the tyranny of the woodpile. By the time the first snows of the next winter fell, 7 more homes, including Crofts and the mayor's, had their own winter sun systems. That winter was just as cold, but it was different. There was less smoke curling from the chimneys, less frantic chopping of wood. There was a sense of security, of quiet confidence. Elara's cabin was no longer an anomaly, it was a prototype. Her strange, solitary project had become the blueprint for their collective survival. She had not only saved them from a storm, she had changed the very nature of their relationship with winter. They had learned, as she had, not to fight it, but to harness it. Years turned into a decade. The winter sun systems became a standard feature of every home in the valley. The annual summer digging was a community ritual, a time of shared labor and preparation. Elara and Liam married in a simple ceremony by the creek where she had first dug for clay. Their life was woven into the fabric of the town she had inadvertently reshaped. She was no longer the strange, solitary girl, but the quiet, respected heart of the community. She taught the children the principles from her grandfather's journals, ensuring the knowledge would not be lost again. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned a distinguished gray, and his movements became slow and deliberate. He still lay by her feet, his patient gaze following her. But now, his sighs were deeper, his sleep longer. One mild spring morning, when the last of the snow had melted and the earth smelled of new life, he did not wake up. He died peacefully in his sleep, his great head resting near the gentle warmth of the radiator that had kept him comfortable for so many winters. Ilara and Liam buried him on the hill overlooking the cabin, beneath a young birch tree. She did not weep loudly, but a profound quietness settled in her, a space shaped by the absence of his constant, loving presence. He had been her first believer, the silent witness to the lonely work that had saved them all. Another decade passed, and then another. Ilara's hair, once the color of dark soil, became streaked with silver. Her hands, though still strong, were mapped with the fine lines of age. She and Liam had children, and those children had children of their own, all of them raised in homes warmed by the impossible alchemy of earth and ice. Her grandfather's journals, their pages soft and stained from 100 hands, were the town's most treasured documents. She lived a long and peaceful life. When her time came, it was much like Boros. She passed away in her sleep on a cold winter's night in the warm, quiet cabin where her story had begun. The entire valley mourned her passing. They knew they had lost more than a neighbor. They had lost their anchor. They buried her on the hill beside Boro, under the now mature birch tree. Liam, old and stooped but with the same kind eyes, carved her headstone himself from a piece of local granite. It was simple, as she would have wanted. It did not list dates or accomplishments in the traditional sense. It bore only her name and a single, simple sentence. Ilara. She taught us how to find the sun in winter. From the hill, one could look down upon the valley. In the depths of another harsh winter, the houses were blanketed in thick snow, their windows glowing with soft, welcoming light. There were almost no plumes of smoke rising from the chimneys. There was only a deep, abiding quiet. Her original cabin stood just as it always had, a small, sturdy structure nestled in the pines. It looked no different from any other, yet it was the source of it all. Its radiator system, the first of its kind, still worked perfectly, a silent, enduring monument to the quiet girl who had listened to the wisdom of the earth, trusted in the knowledge of the past, and through her own patient hands had brought a permanent warmth to the coldest of places. The winter sun, born of her labor, continued to shine.